Greetings and welcome to In Defense of the Revolution, a Cuba Solidarity podcast from a Canadian perspective. My name is Cam Scott, and I'm here with Robert Crooks, as well as a special guest today. Camila Escalante from Cowsichan News is going to join us to talk about the National Endowment for Democracy and U.S. meddling and foreign interference in Cuba and across the Americas. Welcome, Camila.
Thank you for having me.
So perhaps we can begin in overview of this organ of U.S. imperialism. If you could speak a little bit to the National Endowment for Democracy. What is the National Endowment for Democracy and the overarching role that it has played in the Americas?
Well, the NED is supposed to be a private nonprofit organization that we just posted an article on Cowsichan News by John Perry, who's a writer based in Nicaragua, and Roger Harris, who is a really important U.S. activist, who've talked about the way in which the NED is structured and how that allows this organization to circumvent some sort of transparency controls and things like that. But really, it derives all of its funding from money that is set aside by the U.S. Congress in order to send around the world for what is called by the U.S. government foreign assistance programs or foreign assistance awards. And so this is just one of a number of tools and mechanisms that the U.S. government has to be able to disperse money to different countries. And another perhaps larger one is USAID, which a lot of people are familiar with. But the United States decided the U.S. government under the new Trump administration announced in January that they would be taking a closer look at how foreign assistance is carried out and where all of this money is going. They decided to continue along the line of trying to attack things that they see as being woke or as being unnecessary costs to the U.S. taxpayers or the government, that is money that is completely unregulated and out of control and something that's being sent by, the Biden administration and U.S. Democrats. But really, the NED has been around for several decades, I believe, beginning in the Reagan administration. And so it's been administered by both Republicans and Democrats. And, millions and millions of dollars have been disseminated towards, what's called regime change operations, destabilization, different sorts of, propaganda operations, media outlets, and so forth, under not only Republicans in recent administrations, but particularly under Trump's first term. We saw all of these different operations take place, targeting Cuba, targeting other countries of Latin America, and primarily the global South, but other, enemy countries of the U.S., where the U.S. is trying to insert itself to meet its own strategic objectives and fulfill its own interests abroad. It's really just, forms of U.S. intervention in other countries, and they always are doing it in a way that is somewhat overt, somewhat covert. But in this case, they're doing it in what they call foreign assistance. So, we see this in the form of sending money to these news outlets, these propaganda outlets that are on Cuba. They're not necessarily in Cuba. They could be in Cuba. They could be based in Miami or elsewhere, where they try to affect, public perception of Cuba, or where they, to people in the exterior, non-Cubans, but also where they try to, insert that propaganda so that it can affect Cubans on the island itself. They're also funding all sorts of different organizations that have to do with women, that have to do with Afro-descendant people, in this case, Cubans, LGBT people, and all sorts of other targets, knowing that these are, in most parts of the world, more vulnerable populations or populations and groups that wouldn't have access to this sort of funding. And what seems like a very small amount of funding, relatively speaking, because the net actually doesn't give out necessarily as much money to some of these programs and projects that it funds is in comparison to the way in which they receive money from elsewhere, like directly from European governments sometimes. It can have a really large impact, as we know, in countries where, the average person is receiving such a small monthly salary. And so it can really have a really big impact when they find the right people, the key actors, that they feel like they can collaborate with towards trying to undermine the government or the revolutionary process in Cuba.
That was a really thorough answer. Thank you for that. So, just going back to that article that you mentioned from Cowsitchin News by Roger Harris and John Perry, it's funny that they tried to present the NED as this private organization, when in that article it shows that the first NED president, Alan Weinstein, was quoted as saying, "A lot of what we do today was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA," referring to NED or the NED, of course. And I also just wanted to go back to, you had mentioned how Trump sort of canceled funding for NED in, I guess, back in January, and then now has reinstated it partially as of March 10th, I believe, or around that area. But there's also, these sort of interesting struggles that have been going on in the Trump administration around this particular issue. CNN reported on May 8th that the CIA was seeking to elevate covert operations by hiring more officers to go into the field and fewer analysts to sit behind computer screens. So, it seemed like maybe there was this switch from something that was more public, or at least had some level of transparency, like the NED would talk about who it's funding on its website, at least, even though I'm sure there was a lot of more secretive stuff going on in the background. But it seems like the CIA now wants to go completely covert. And then at the same time, you have Mauricio Claver Corone, who was the special envoy for Latin America. He resigned, and there seemed to be some sort of struggle between him and Marco Rubio, especially in terms of how they saw the Trump administration's strategy in Latin America. So do you have any insight into why they decided to take away funding and then reinstate the funding to the NED?
I think that it was just a little bit of the strategy that has been covered in some media. That is a strategy that actually comes from Steve Bannon, who's supposed to be a mastermind behind Trump and one of his chief advisors, and someone who's doing a lot of moving the pieces without anyone seeing. He's, been a strategist for Trump in the past, and also has given a lot of advice to far-right actors around the world, including Jair Bolsonaro. But, what those sorts of analysis say is that part of the Trump's administration's strategy has been to try to come out and confuse people, overwhelm the news cycle and citizens with a number of very swift changes to policy, and a lot of rhetoric, a lot of discourse that causes mass confusion. And then they can quietly behind the scenes do what they're actually doing. And I see this as playing out a little bit in El Salvador in the case of Nayib Bukele, where, a lot of his government or governing style is just PR. It's just marketing and public relations. It's finding a really nice way to make a glossy picture of what's going on in the country. In the case of the U.S., it's the department that's headed by Elon Musk. They believe that those people who voted for Trump are really angry about the nonstop, uncontrolled spending of the Democrats in years past, and that people want lower taxes, they want to find savings and everything else. And so this seemed like a good, sort of campaign for them within their administration to say that they're, administering the citizens' money in a better way. And so they were using, these sorts of claims about claims that are actually in many cases true about how the United States, through its foreign assistance programs, is funding things like feminist indigenous women's basket weaving in different countries of Latin America. And that's actually like almost completely true. And I had seen that over the years being announced, particularly by the Democrats, but it surely went on for many years throughout the different administrations. I do think that the US Democrats took they made a concerted effort to do more things like that. And so the Trump administration was able to say that we don't want our money going towards that. But it's important to say that the recipients of this money, the different entities, which as you said, we're not going to be knowing in the future anymore who some of these are because of the explicit policy that the Ned now has to conceal who the recipients are, because they, of course, say that they want to protect these individuals and organizations from the communist regimes or whatever it is they're saying. But the people and the organizations and entities that have been receiving this money for years and years, going back to at least the last Trump administration, were often friends of Marco Rubio himself. We know that in the case of Venezuela, it was some of these different right-wing political parties, of which there are many, led by the main opposition leaders. They each have their own political parties and movements, and they have their different organizations, which are NGOs, nonprofits or whatever. And it's through those that they're receiving money from Israel. They're receiving money from different European groups, but in many ways, they're receiving money from the United States through sometimes USAID and the Ned, but through other means as well. And so, given that these are actors that Marco Rubio himself supports and he can stand by because they're his friends and close allies in Latin America, there was no way that they were going to discontinue support for these different projects. You could say that some of these projects and these, coup and destabilization attempts have been outright failures, and they haven't achieved their desired or intended objectives. But they do have the effect of, creating a lot of noise, to at least the point where in the international media, countries like Cuba and Venezuela and Nicaragua are painted extraordinarily negatively, and the human rights industry, that whole number of organizations and the people who are highly paid within that industry that's largely based out of, Geneva, Brussels, obviously Washington and other places, they are attacking these revolutionary processes using supposed data and information that is sent to them from these ground actors. And these ground actors are directly linked to Marco Rubio. So he's not going to be cutting them off anytime soon. He may be ending, there may be a restructuring, and they may be changing things in order to ensure that those indigenous feminist women's basket weaving collectives no longer receive that funding, but they're still going to be sending money in other ways, because they do think that it's very important to keep those actors plugged in, as was the case in Bolivia during the 2019 coup. We saw that the Ned actually sent, I don't know if it was in 2018 or 2019, but almost $90,000 to one single small basically fringe Christian news outlet called Agencia Noticias Fides in order to propagate a lot of that anti-Evo Morales information, which is a lot of times taken out of context or taken verbatim and published and translated into multiple languages all around the world. So I really think that when they conduct operations like that in Cuba, Venezuela, or elsewhere, that it actually does have some payoff. And so for that reason, I think they always intended to maintain this project funding, and they really just wanted to have it under more direct and consolidated control of Marco Rubio, who, by the way, is now, not only the Secretary of State, but he's also the National Security Advisor, and he was also put directly in control of the NED and the USAID and other things. So it's Cuba and Latin America's number one enemy is now consolidating power even within the Trump administration. So this is someone who's very, in a lot of ways, intelligent because he knows what's going on all around Latin America and in many parts of the world where the U.S. has, stated enemies. And so he is going to be able to, take his anti-communist objectives and really just take all of the money and all of those resources and put them perhaps to better use when attacking these countries.
That's so well put, and I think that that's an absolutely correct analysis. I'm so fascinated by the contradictions and the cleaves within the U.S. government. You were speaking of these very culturally specific programs for indigenous women, and you mentioned the focus on Afro-Cubans and LGBTQ people. And I think it's fascinating to see the way that anti-Cuban forces try to move against the Cuban government by way of these marginalized populations where long-term colonial disparities that Cuba inherited and has been actively combating are attributed to the government itself. And it seems clear that this is reifying racial iniquities and gender oppression that Cuba would oppose. But the NED grantee, the International Institute for Race Equality and Human Rights or something like this, was still producing reports on marriage equality in Cuba during the period of consultation that preceded the new Families Code and the remarkable gains that it protects. So this is a document that's far and above more progressive than any comparable legislation anywhere in the world, as we know, but it can't dissuade the NED narrative. So I'm interested in how this runs up against MAGA's anti-woke agenda, as you say, which is obviously a pretense for dismantling various facets of state support domestically, but has this effect of weakening some former means of foreign interference too. You listed in your article, along with the sums of money allocated, these projects with lofty titles, empowering citizens, raising awareness, humanistic sounding verbs, and I'm curious how we can insist upon the progressive reality of Cuba and Cuban society over against this opposition narrative as it seizes upon matters of religious freedom or independent trade unions, things that obviously do exist in Cuba, but these projects are purposed at specifically.
Well, I'm not sure I know any of the specific details about that, but I'll go back to what you said about, Cuba actually has some uniquely positive indicators, as do Venezuela and Cuba, when it comes to certain areas that the U.S. wants to discredit or obscure. Like you said, the family code and the different progressive legislation in Cuba is far ahead than anything that exists in the United States, and also just indicators such as the lack of homelessness in Cuba, the high level of education, given that again, it's a country with very low incomes. In a household, the salaries are very low, and they don't have the resources, particularly technologically, that other countries of the world or even Latin America have access to. And yet, it's one of the most educated countries in the world that not only is able to educate their own people, but also to bring of foreign students, particularly youth under the age of 25, to study for free and get a medical degree from the ELAM. So there's all sorts of different things. There's another article that just was published on Calcetcha News recently about the fact that Cuba has the second highest number of women parliamentarians in its National Assembly. So even though the United States tries to go around preaching about feminism and women's rights, particularly under the Democratic Party administrations, it's actually Cuba that should be teaching the United States, Canada, and Europe about what it's like to be able to give women power in the country. And it's very clear that if Cuba had any of the means that most other countries in the world have, that it would be a country where women were hugely empowered, and it would be demonstrated on every level, though it already is. And so, these are things that through these different funded projects, they're trying to discredit all of the time. It's really difficult looking at these dollar amounts, $100,000 to $200,000 for some of them. What it is that they're going to be funding going forward. Though we might be able to go back to 2024 and see what was actually approved for this year. But a lot of the things that they have done in order to affect citizens' perceptions in these different countries is that they have funded polling firms and these different companies and news outlets that will publish just absolutely fake numbers that were generated in the United States about people's perceptions about the country, about socialist governance, about different, the economy and everything else. And then those are being disseminated in different languages and around the world as well. In 2024, Ned aside, funding for media related to Cuba was $2.3 million from USAID last year. So it's probably about the same this year. And again, that's a huge amount of money, whether there are some people receiving that money within Cuba or whether they're sprinkled around Latin America and primarily in the US, and it's some sort of supplemental income to whatever else they're receiving. It's a lot of money. And I think as someone who founded my own news outlet, Calcetcha News, these budgets can be very impactful because, again, they are receiving money from other sources, such as wealthy donors of, the Cuban oligarchy of years past, and all sorts of other dark money that we don't know. Calcetcha News, my outlet, has now been around for 5 years.
Incredible.
Started during the coup in Bolivia. And we have operated almost since the beginning on a budget of anywhere from $0 a month to $900 a month was at the absolute peak when we were doing a regular podcast. And we had people subscribing to the podcast. So I can tell you that it takes a lot of effort to sustain a media project like this. And it would be really impactful to have, $139,000 in a year. And that's just coming from one source. And so they're able to do quite a lot. And they also, these different nonprofits have other resources that might not be money as well, because, they do things like, they have things like free web hosting, like free printing, all sorts of other things. And it's really important to say as well that not only are these different existing projects and programs, well, they're created or they already exist and they're being funded through these foreign assistance programs, but also the United States and, I guess European allies, they have things such as the Oslo Freedom Forum and other internship type opportunities, they call them, for largely for young people and people who have shown, demonstrated an interest in doing this sort of so-called democracy promotion. They're democracy activists. They are aspiring citizen journalists, or they're citizen journalists, and they want to, combat socialism or whatever it is, and they're actually able to travel for free, go attend these different meetings where they make connections. And they really are just junior employees of the US State Department and sometimes, the UK Foreign Office or whatever it is. And they're receiving grants from all sorts of different sources, but they're chosen because of the trajectory they have of opposing, these revolutionary governments. So they have a really there's a lot going on here. And just to list some of the other things that the U.S. does in addition to its foreign assistance programs, there's, all sorts of different operations. So, I already mentioned USAID. The United States is attacking Cuba through the imposition of unilateral coercive measures that have been maintained for, 6 decades now. The United States actually continues to try to influence international forums like the UN Human Rights Commission and, the UN in general, and try to influence the international community about what it says are the human rights abuses and the threats against democracy coming from Cuba, even though, of course, time and time again, the world has shown that the U.S. and in this case, in this year, Israel are isolated because the world continues to demand the lifting of the unilateral coercive measures of the blockade.
Yeah.
And then, they have their entire media propaganda campaign against Cuba, particularly under Marco Rubio. He has put so much emphasis on campaigning against the Cuban medical missions and medical cooperation and, pressing this claim that Cuba is trafficking its doctors, something that has been outright rejected by so many countries of the Caribbean and Latin America and the rest of the global South. And then, of course, in addition, they have these designations in the listing of Cuba and other countries of these different designations, which can have a number of implications. And then the other thing that the United States, one of the other examples of things that the United States has poured money into was in 2021. First of all, in 2021, there was that operation that we know, where they tried to create destabilization and a day of unrest, which was really launched out of Cuba. But they also created that sort of Cuban Twitter, the Zunzuneo, which was a Twitter type of social media network, which is something that's very expensive to create, but which at one point they had tens of thousands of people using it to try to steer people in an anti-government direction. And then, of course, there's the, very aggressive, other forms of aggressive intimidation of Cuba, such as the occupation of Guantanamo. And so I do think that it's important that people, think of all of these different things that are going on. First and foremost, the strangulation of the Cuban economy because of the blockade. Because when you actually look at these numbers, you might say, 6.6 million. The U.S. actually spends a whole lot more than that targeting Russia and Belarus. But it's a very large amount of money for Cuba. And it's just one of a long list of things that the US is doing to try to undermine and attack the revolution.
Absolutely. And Cuba has a relatively small population too, right? So 6.6 million is still a lot of money, and that's, as you've pointed out, that's just from NED. You know, first of all, I want to echo something that Cam said off the top of the episode, that, you know, with you giving us some insight into the background of Cossack News, like, it's such an important resource, and I really urge anybody listening to this to, like, make sure that they're following and reading it, because it is such an important resource. You know, in your article, you quote NED's mission in Cuba, which I just think is so arrogant. Like, the way that these people talk about their operations in basically regime change and attempted regime change. I also think we as Cuba solidarity activists need to do more to dispel this idea that Cuba is not democratic, because of course anybody who understands the democratic system in Cuba knows that they're one of the most democratic countries in the world, if not the most democratic country in the world. And, you know, often when I'm out at protests or leafleting about Cuba and I'm talking to people, they're surprised to learn that people even get to vote in Cuba. Like, they really don't have any clue. They just believe this sort of nonsense about totalitarian rule. But just to take a quote from NED's stated mission in Cuba, they say key objectives include enhancing access to independent, pluralistic information to foster a more well-informed, critically minded citizenry, which is, you know, obviously that's so ridiculous, because if you look at countries like Canada and the United States, there's no question that the average Cuban is, you know, much better informed, is probably a much more critical thinker than people in Canada and the United States. And it's not because of anything inherent in the peoples, but it has to do with the education system, as you talked about, right? The education system is much more robust in Cuba. It's much more accessible to people. Like, you know, a lot of people in Canada and the United States have to leave high school to go to work, let alone being able to afford to get into college or university. But I want to go back to talking about the protests in July 2021, because that's sort of still used as a cudgel against Cuba. But I was looking up some stuff, and it looked like NED backed a group called Archivo Cuba, sent them $500,000 in 2021 alone. And I'm just wondering if you would be able to, like, sort of expand on what sort of role a group like that or other groups played in trying to foment, I guess, dissent in Cuba itself, and how it connects that to like the public image of Cuba in, like, global media.
Right. Well, it's been a while since I've looked at, you know, the details of what happened in July 2021, but I remember where I was when it all was unfolding. Well, I was in Nicaragua, but, you know, these groups are really just, first and foremost, ways of creating networks to connect people within the country, within Cuba, ground actors, to the people who actually have resources on the outside, which is people with money, primarily in Miami and perhaps Washington, and find ways of ensuring that those funds get to them so that they have those incentives to be able to do things like hold meetings, organize subversive activities, and then do things that are being incentivized, such as create art, create social media posts, which might be commissioned by these people on the exterior. I mean, we've literally seen it in every country of Latin America. People are not doing this on their own, although to some extent, you know, there could be social protest in Cuba, there could be dissent, but a lot of what they're doing is paid per tweet type activities. And so it's just this entire, it's this entire machinery that's created, you know, connecting people through whether it be WhatsApp, Facebook, or other means to try to get young people to create some sort of chaos in the country. And in terms of what sort of effect it has on the outside and the perceptions of Cuba as well, the United States is always fueling psychological warfare, not only within Cuba, trying to insert that among the population, but also doing that now on social media, but before, through the media, before social media. And the operations now are a lot of times this online discourse, like the discourse which emerges from time to time on X, on Instagram, maybe even on TikTok now, surely on TikTok now, which is trying to, for example, paint Fidel Castro and Che as sexist, as racist, as whatever it is that they want to try to portray. And they actually try to, spin all of these issues using identity politics, using these absolutely false claims, but all of which can be retraced to people like Marco Rubio, who oftentimes, in the case of Marco, was the first person to even say some of this stuff. Other times, it was people like Mike Pompeo, who was formerly the head of the CIA. So it's not without origin. We know where to retrace these different claims, and a lot of times they're being sent out by people who are either outright just critics of the Cuban government in the United States. Other times it's using Black Americans who are intent on this sort of identity politics angled stuff where they go after every revolutionary leader. I mean, at this point, they must have gone after Thomas Sankara. They must have gone after the Black Panthers and everyone else. And they just happen to be doing it now to Cuba. It's very suspicious, but unfortunately, like you said, for a lot of average readers or internet users, they don't know how to distinguish what's real from what's just, online generated discourse that has absolutely no basis in reality.
No, it's entirely unreal. I just want to quickly add briefly, you mentioned the Cuba Archive, Rob, which is based in Washington, but the executive director of the archive, I think, is a former vice president of Chase Manhattan Bank, notably nationalized by Castro in 1960. But you don't have to look so far to see what people really mean when they say economic freedom, but I digress.
I just want to mention too, I mean, and this is something that, both you, Cam, and Camila have sort of touched on, but it's interesting, right, that the U.S. blockade causes these issues or perpetuates issues that are like vestiges of colonial rule in Cuba, and then, blames them for it, which is just such a slimy tactic. And you wonder sometimes, like, is Marco Rubio just... like he's just like an evil person. Like, I don't understand how you could be so cynical. Be like, we're going to blockade, make sure no food gets to Cuba, and then we're going to blame the Cuban government for starving its people. Like, it's just, it's hideous.
He is extremely cynical and sinister. And we have seen time and time again, and unfortunately, I haven't always documented it, and I don't think that the average person in the US who might be critical of someone like Marco Rubio, maybe we haven't done a good job as journalists to document the way in which Marco Rubio has, like Mike Pompeo, really implanted or inserted these outright lies whenever it was convenient or whenever they were trying to generate a situation about Latin America. And they did so, at a time when it was very, convenient for them to do so. I remember in 2000 2019, at the time that after Juan Guaido swore himself as interim president of Venezuela, whatever, parachuted in to the streets of Caracas by Washington, and they tried to do that humanitarian aid storming of the Venezuela-Colombia border. What the things that were being tweeted onto social media by Marco Rubio during those 24 to 48 hours should be studied, because he said things that were outright lies, because he knew that they were trying to generate convulsion and overthrow the government, and it was a now or never situation. The entire West, particularly, these NATO type countries, were throwing their weight behind Juan Guaido and the US government and anything that was going to take place under Ivan Duque's government there. And he was saying things like citing numbers of, supposed members of the Bolivarian National Armed Forces who were defecting in mass, is what he was claiming, and saying that they were refusing to do this and that. We all found out at the end that some very small, limited number of people had defected that day, and actually just in the course of the last however many 6 years or whatever it's been since that whole Guaido episode. And he was just saying things that were just completely false. So I think it's really important that people know that some of the things that they're saying are just outright attempts to psyop or false flag us into believing certain things and to push, other actions that they have. The other thing that Marco Rubio does from his own social media accounts, and I have to say, he has had 4 different Twitter accounts, official Twitter accounts belonging to him in the history of Twitter. Why does someone need 4? One of them was, as senator, one was as himself, one was as himself for a senator in Spanish. Now he has his Secretary Rubio one. Just to push out false information. He does things like, from his official account, retweet Maria Corina Machado, the head of the Venezuelan opposition. So, this is how he's using his official post. They're doing it overtly. What we're saying now, what we're warning of, or what many writers have warned about, is that the Ned is now going to be turning back. It seems like they're making a turn towards erasing data. They had at USAID, they directed USAID employees to shred all of the documents, but they're doing that at NED as well. And so, they're going to have a different method and approach to things. But a lot of it is just being done out in the open if anyone were to pay attention. And I just wanted to mention, because I have this, or I had an article in front of me, just something that we published in February on Kausachun as well, which was, speaking about USAID, which funds, similar parallel projects in these countries. In Cuba, between 2001 and 2006, USAID allocated, or USAID, however you want to, say the acronym, because all of these government officials themselves say it differently. The U.S. allocated $61 million for 142 projects and activities against Cuba between 2001 and 2006. So, and countless, so we're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars from just this one U.S. supposed aid agency, in addition to, or including, all of the money that is put towards financing these so-called media outlets. And so we can only expect for these sorts of operations to become more intensified, because Marco Rubio has put a target on Cuba. And we see that with the Trump administration making its moves to now purpose Guantanamo naval base for other things now, and try to wiggle and taunt Cuba in different ways now, through different means. So I think it's only going to become much worse. And, the way things are going throughout the rest of Latin America, they really are moving their different actors in the different countries, and they see the trajectory of things going towards the direction of far-right governments being elected through popular vote or through fraud, in the case of Argentina, Ecuador, and El Salvador as examples. And I think they're really going to use that opportunity to try to destabilize the other countries as well.
Yeah, it's frightful. And I think that the U.S. is trying to taunt at some of the strong affinities in Latin America by placing Venezuelan deportees in Guantanamo and the like. I'm fascinated, too, by how you track the vacillations of the U.S. right and the differences within the government, because I read yesterday that Rubio refuses to accept the U.S. National Intelligence Council's determination that Venezuelan gangs are not a proxy force of Maduro's government. Of course, but that was the pretense under which the U.S. invoked the Alien Enemies Act. Rubio's just out there with the FBI rejecting the outcome of the inquiry. So he'll say whatever will expedite his larger designs, but these cleaves within the U.S. government are so interesting.
Yeah, I would say that he's someone who has been a really important actor since the very beginning, at least, of Trump's first term. And I don't think that people have given him enough credit for being the mastermind behind some of these extremely sinister policies. The first time that the former Southcom commander, Laura Richardson, spoke before a Senate hearing about the U.S.'s Southcom operations in Latin America, it was absolutely disastrous. She didn't know what she was talking about. She didn't really have a lot of practice or a lot of statistics in front of her, et cetera, et cetera. Then she went and held meetings with Marco Rubio and was briefed about what the U.S. really bipartisan line is on Latin America, which is not to say that all Democrats see things the same as Republicans on particular issues, but in general, the approach tends to be the same over the whole of Latin America. And she came back for the next appearance before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and gave a whole new report and recited her answers to questions completely differently. This is a Southcom commander that was, put into office by a Democratic president, and by no means someone that the Republicans would have chosen. But when it came to issues of Latin America, I believe that they were all being dictated throughout the Biden administration by Marco Rubio. A senator from Florida had that much influence over, national politics, over the military strategy towards Latin America. And so I think this is someone that has proven themselves. And when it comes to things, like you said, a national security report about Venezuelan gangs, I think Marco Rubio will always take precedent. He'll always be the more important advisor and voice within the Trump administration to Trump himself, and he'll be the decider. He's someone who is very keen on what the talking points and what the U.S. position is regarding China specifically. And really, when you look at what the United States is doing around Latin America and the Caribbean, they're going around from country to country, government to government, meeting them and asking and bribing and negotiating with them so that these countries will leave the Belt and Road Initiative and cease to do business with China and cease to cooperate with China. And they were successful recently in Panama And they will continue to put pressure on a lot of these other governments to do the same. And Marco Rubio has highlighted the closeness and the very high levels of cooperation between the government of Cuba and China, and of course, China and Nicaragua and Venezuela as well. And so that will continue to be a focus of this Trump administration.
Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks so much. Do you want to let people know where they can find you?
So the best place to find my work is on our website, cowsachun.com. It's where I do the bulk of my reporting on Latin America. Cowsachun News is an outlet that we started on social media, and then we later came up with a website. But in these current times, when a lot is happening around the world, and Latin America often gets forgotten, we're continuing to cover everything that's taking place, and particularly with the revolutionary processes that are continuing in Latin America, which are Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, the socialist parties and movements around Latin America outside of those countries as well. So you can find us on our website, cowsachun.com, and then on social media, it's Cowsachun News on TikTok, Twitter, Instagram, and Blue Sky, which I don't know if anyone uses Blue Sky, but if anyone feels the need to use something that's not X, we're on there as well.
Que el pueblo después de un año repite, gracias Fidel.